Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamie Rowen as this semester's Beto speaker. Dr. Jamie Rowen is a professor of legal studies and political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's also the founder and director of the Center for Justice, Law, and Societies. Dr. Rowen's research focuses on the use of law to redress mass atrocity and aid vulnerable groups. Her most recent book, Worthy of Justice, The Practices and Politics of Veterans Treatment Courts, was supported by a National Science Foundation Career Award. Her first book, Searching for Truth in the Transitional Justice Movement, focuses on the emergence of transitional justice, where she examines efforts to make truth commissions in the Balkans, Colombia, and the United States to reveal the appeal and the dilemma of pursuing quasi-judicial interventions in the wake of mass violence. Dr. Rowen's scholarship on domestic and international law has been published in multiple well-renowned journals, including Law and Society Review, Law and Social Inquiry, Law and Policy, Human Rights Quarterly, among others. Dr. Rowen is also a regular contributor to The Conversation, WWLP Radio, WBAI, and the Attitude with Arnie podcast radio series. Please join me in giving Dr. Rowen a warm welcome to Sam Houston.
So thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure. I'm very grateful, especially to Elizabeth. Thank you for the introduction and your generosity over the last couple of days, to Studi, who is in charge of this series, and especially to Professor Danielle Rudes, who is the reason I'm here. We go way back. She actually taught me qualitative methods and analysis, I think 15 years ago. At UC Berkeley when I was a graduate student and pursuing a law degree. And so it was when I had the opportunity to come to Houston and I reached out, this seemed like a really great opportunity to talk to you all about my research. What I want to do today is introduce you to these really interesting judicial mechanisms, these veterans treatment courts, and talk a little bit about my book, because it uses these courts to shine a light on broader questions about inequality in the US. So that is sort of the overall goal of the book, even though we're talking about this specific policy intervention. Now, many of you are studying to do research and also wonder, what does it look like to come to a project? And I want to explain a little bit about my background because it affects the way that I approach this topic. So as the introduction showed, my work is in international human rights. Since I was a teenager, have been very interested in the use of law to redress mass atrocity. And so I wrote my first book on a novel at the time intervention called The Truth Commission. And I wrote about why that intervention emerged and then how it gets implemented in different places. And so I'm inherently comparative in thinking about these questions and not to take them for granted. These types of judicial interventions don't come out of nowhere, and they don't necessarily emerge because they're the best way to deal with the issue, right? So why do these particular interventions emerge? Whose interests are at play? And then how does context sort of shape the way that this ideal of the intervention gets implemented? When I settled in Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, I wanted to look more at what was going on domestically, and given my interest in how law is used to address mass atrocity, I turned to this thing I had heard about, a veterans treatment court in my local community, thinking that veterans treatment courts, like a truth commission, might be used to address the long-term consequences of war, the damage that it does to individuals. And so I walked into my local veterans treatment court and I sat down and I watched a hearing, expecting to have some conversation about the long-term effects of war and the identity that that creates for the people that are in this criminal legal space. And what I realized was there is no mention of the military. There is no mention of war. I can't tell what distinguishes this from a drug court. And so the story that I was hearing about veterans treatment courts, that these were being created to help veterans dealing with the long-term effects of being in the military, and that's code for combat, actually, was not what I was seeing in the courtroom. And it led me to want to explore more deeply, what is the disconnect between the story that people tell about these veterans treatment courts, which are basically adult drug treatment courts for veterans, and the reality of what goes on inside of them. The common narrative, and I want to say this isn't just the common narrative, this is the mobilizing narrative. This is the story that legislatures use to fund veterans treatment courts. This is the narrative that researchers still use to explain what these courts are doing, is that veterans deserve more favorable and supportive procedures of the Veterans Treatment Court, a specialized treatment court just for them, because of the sacrifices they have made for their country. There's also another piece to that they have unique needs based on their experiences in the military that a court just for them can address, right? So that's number two. VTCs are uniquely capable of helping veterans because they address the underlying causes of veteran criminalized offending. You can already in the mobilizing narrative pause and say, that's curious. It seems to suggest that all veterans have similar causes of criminal offending, right? And it seems to suggest that a court procedure is going to be what helps them, right? And so as I was exploring veterans treatment courts, the research on them, the stories that I heard people telling about them, I was always keeping in mind, well, what is the disconnect between this narrative and what I see? Now, let's just start with what these veterans treatment courts are. I say in my book, this is basically add veteran and stir to the drug treatment court, all right? And that's actually kind of its origin story. So the very first veterans treatment court, and for those unfamiliar with treatment courts, these are really dockets of individuals that get a special hearing within a courthouse, and the hearing is designed for them to tell about how they're doing with their mandated behavioral health requirements of the court. And then they eventually can graduate with some type of criminal legal benefit. And we'll talk a little bit about the details of that as we go along. But the first separate docket for veterans was in 2004 in Anchorage, Alaska. And that is a place, was born there. I'm from Alaska. There's a lot of veterans there. And there's a lot of substance use disorder in Alaska. And a judge who was overseeing a drug treatment court noticed that a lot of the participants in his courtroom were veterans and thought, I think we have enough to create a separate docket just for them. And he went to his team and he said, I would like to create a separate docket just for veterans. And they said, that's really expensive, right? Because it requires having an extra clinician oftentimes. It requires mandating treatment that then needs to get paid for. And someone else in the room said, you know, the VA is here and the VA can give them the treatment. We're not going to need more resources. All right. Buffalo in 2008, similar story, parallel, isn't following what's going on in Alaska. And a judge, himself a veteran, is overseeing a drug treatment court. This is the famous origin story of VTCs. They often leave out the Alaska piece. But this judge, Judge Russell, notices there's a lot of veterans in his court. And he says to a friend of his who is also a veteran who works at the local VA, I think that this guy who I just saw would benefit from talking to another veteran because he seems to have a lot of military-related trauma, and it might be helpful for him to talk to other veterans that can help him participate in this program more effectively, get sober, all of these things. And that man, his name's Jack, said, that's a great idea. Let me talk to him. And Judge Russell and Jack said, wow, that seemed to really work. I wonder if that would work with other veterans. If we asked all of the veterans that are in the treatment court to meet with other veterans to have more support. And they called up their local VA and they said, hi, VA, would you be open to helping out veterans in our drug treatment court with some more specialized services? And the VA was like, I don't know if I want to get involved with the criminal legal system. We are a health provider. You force treatment. There's a disconnect here. But Jack was close with the head of his local VA health center, and it worked. Well, that court got some pushback from the local police who said, are you giving a get out of jail card, free to the veterans and not other people? But they kept going, and about a year and a half later, there was a New York Times article and an NPR article about this court. And it told the common narrative. It said veterans are in this court because of things related to combat and they have trauma. This court can help them. Let's go. All right. And so this treatment court picks up in popularity and is now the second most common treatment court in the entire country. by VA standards, by VA documents, there's somewhere around 745, whether it's standalone courts or veterans separate docket. So rapid growth of veterans treatment courts. They now surpass mental health treatment courts, which originated in 1994 as being the second most common treatment court out there, second to the adult drug treatment court. Now, the thing about these courts and why I say they are ad veteran and stir is they build from the adult drug treatment court model very explicitly, right? So Judge Russell worked with what was then called the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, now known as All-Rise, to create standards for these courts and used the drug court model. So we're mandating sobriety. We have teams that work in collaboration, whether it is prosecutors and defense, if we are pre-plea, or probation and defense, if we're post-disposition. And they work collaboratively to mandate that the participants get treatment, and if they comply, they graduate, right? And so the adult drug treatment court model really emphasizes sobriety because that was the sort of idea of what treatment courts were going to do. Now, the entry criteria for veterans treatment courts are pretty similar to adult drug treatment courts, only you have to have served in the military. Now, courts across the country vary in their entry criteria, adult drug treatment courts too. But what courts will often do is they'll say, what are you charged with? And they will say things like certain violent felonies, you are not eligible to enter this particular program, right? Sexual crimes, no. But courts have very different rules for what types of crimes are allowed in. Some courts only serve people who have misdemeanors. Some courts work like the one in Massachusetts in a state that has a law that says a first-time veteran offender accused of a misdemeanor is, here's a ticket basically, right? Like we are absolutely not going to be putting you in a treatment court, which is actually very demanding, right? And so these entry rules really shape who is in the courts, right? Which shapes this other end of that people are often interested in terms of graduation rates and recidivism, right? These entry rules are really important. But the entry rule that I found really interesting about a veterans treatment court is they require you to be a veteran. Well, it turns out that by federal law, being a veteran means that you left the military under honorable conditions, right? Or another type of discharge. This is not veterans. The word veteran is not, I joined the military. The word veteran is, I was discharged under honorable conditions and I have access to the VA, which is the largest publicly funded healthcare system in the country. It doesn't just provide healthcare, it provides education benefits, it provides housing loans. It is an extraordinary behemoth of an agency, and the amount of money that goes to veterans in terms of our public funded social services, it just surpasses anything that we who are not in the military could imagine. It's just not available to people who didn't join the military. And so requiring people to have VA eligibility, it gives these courts the extra bonus of all of those resources. But you could imagine that many of the people with substance use disorders that are engaged in criminal behavior may not have left the military under honorable conditions. And so that status of being a veteran does a level of work in these courts that make it really different than a regular adult drug treatment court. And so in my book, I actually go through the history of the veterans, the Bureau of Veterans Affairs, the VA, to sort of illustrate you can't understand these courts without understanding the VA. And doing so pushes us to thinking about what kinds of inherent inequalities are actually operating in these courts. So one thing to know about these courts, everyone always asks, and I'll just stay out front, is we don't know about whether these courts work better for veterans or not, right? That the data on this is just wide open. The most, comprehensive overviews of studies just basically say the studies are so poorly designed, we don't know. And the reason is that, are we talking about veterans who choose not to go into these courts compared to the veterans who do? Well, you've got such a selection bias there in terms of who decides they want to go through this kind of surveillance. Then what about veterans who choose a veterans treatment court over a regular drug treatment court? What we do know is if you choose a veterans treatment court over a regular drug treatment court, you are more likely to spend time detained actually, than a person who goes to the regular drug treatment court, which I think has to do with the level of resources and surveillance that these courts have because they have access to VA resources. But that's a comprehensive study of VA eligible veterans. But most of the studies, the range of recidivism, which is defined in all sorts of varied ways too, is, it varies from, 2% to 74%. Like, we really don't know if these courts are doing anything better than any other type of criminal legal process, but we do know they are wildly popular, right? And they're constantly getting created all over the country. You have one here in Houston. Again, they're in all states except Vermont and Connecticut at this point. And my slide doesn't want to go. There we go. So, all right. So I'm interested in all those details. The research on this is still emerging, but my questions are not really about do these work or not. Those are important questions. But my background is really like thinking about like, how did this come about, right? And what does it tell us about something broader about how we use law to solve entrenched social and political problems, right? We're talking about poverty, we're talking about substance use disorder, we're talking about mental health, and now we're talking about militarism and war. And we're like, this court is going to address those things, right? So how does it do that? And right? And why do we think it can? But, when I look at veterans treatment courts and when I walked into this veterans treatment court, one of the things I noticed was that the people in that courtroom were treated differently than the criminal legal defendants I've seen in regular courtrooms, right? There was something going on in that courtroom that really did make it different. And when I think about difference, I start to think about inequality. There's inequalities that are baked into these courts. I've already sort of alluded to some of them with the VA. Right? But what kinds of inequalities do we see in the way that these treatment courts operate? So those were my sort of big research questions that I decided to answer through the study of VTCs. I was very fortunate to have access to federal funding before it got limited to studies like this. And because of that, I was able to study 3 different courts across the country. And so I did a case comparison between a court I call Northeast, a court I call Southeast, and a court I call West. I was in Northeast. I have 77 observations of weekly hearings. I have 97 in West, and I have 97 in Southeast, and I have 37 in West. And West, I had staggered this for just my own capacity. But also COVID complicated things because the study started in 2016 and ended in 2022. And so I ended up doing online observations of the court hearings, which I can speak to in the Q&A a bit. It didn't actually change my findings. The findings about these 3 courts, the insights I got from them were almost just exacerbated and confirmed by what happened during COVID. But so I was able to watch weekly sessions, and most of the data in the book is about those weekly sessions. And the reason is that I have the same data from all the courts, but I have additional data from individual courts. So in Northeast, I had access to mentor meeting transcripts because there was a documentarian who was studying that court and had videoed the mentor meetings. So these are veteran peer mentors who support the participants in the court. And I had 32 transcripts of those early meetings when this court originated. So I understood that background in Northeast really well. And Northeast, I was also able to go to the residential facility where most of the participants live and observe the residential facility and observe not AA meetings, but like the equivalent of those types of support group meetings to really learn about the participants and what their struggles were. And based on another grant, I interviewed 12 people living in that residential facility. I was also able to go to a nearby veterans pod in a jail, interview 5 veterans in that pod and sort of see these other kinds of benefits that veterans were getting within the criminal legal system. I also have some administrative case summary transcripts from there too. In Southeast, I had more observations. I had an incredible team of research assistants there weekly documenting what was going on in Southeast, and taking notes on, what was happening before, during, and after the hearings, in addition to the observations I was able to do. And I was able to attend one staffing meeting in Southeast to see what goes on sort of behind the scenes. West, interestingly, was the most open to me. They let me watch all of their staffing meetings in addition to the court hearings. So I got behind the scenes in West in a way that I didn't have access to in the other two courts. So that was sort of my observational data. I also and I had administrative data from Southeast as well as from a snapshot of administrative data in West as well. I also interviewed 55 people working across these three courts, as well as some of the national figures. I interviewed some of those folks multiple times, so it was actually 72 interviews total, but with 55 different actors. Asking them about their different roles in creating the Veterans Treatment Court, but also the regular interviews with the judges and the probation officers and the prosecutors and defense attorneys over time. I talked about those observations in the residential facility. There is a national conference that, like I said, called the National Association of Drug Court Professionals that meets every year, and the registration fee is $1,000. And so there was no way I was going to be able to go there, except that I had federal funding. And I'll keep pounding that because research funding is really important. So I was able to go to 3 of those conferences, one of them in Houston in 2023. That was my first time in this area. So I was able to attend those conferences, and they have a separate Veterans Treatment Court track. And so every day, if you're on that track, you are learning about the latest research and really advocacy on veterans treatment courts. Who's leading those sessions? What are they talking about? What's the stories they're telling about what's going on in these courts, what they should be doing, what they're not doing? And so I was there for over the course of 3 conferences, 7 full days of looking at how the national story about the veterans treatment courts is going on. And then, like I said, I have some other observations and administrative data. So this is my data. So I collected all this data over a long period of time. And then I had to figure out what story I wanted to tell about it. And I had to rewrite the book actually a few times, because there's many stories to tell when you collect this amount of data. And at some point, a colleague said to me, "What interests you most?" And I said, I cannot believe the resources that veterans have access to. And I can't believe the way they're treated in these courtrooms. It's just so distinct. And it really helps me think about why certain people get certain benefits in this country and why certain people don't. So the way that I chose to answer my big questions was to tease out these inherent contradictions in VTCs. Now, obviously, what you see when you're watching this courtroom is a bunch of people trying to help veterans and trying to convince them that they're there to help them. And I went back and forth on, should we call this "thank you for your service"? Because there's this element of "thank you for your service" that's animating a lot of the courts. And so I have a chapter in the book that talks about this sort of gratitude logic that is being imposed, right? That the staff in the courts are like, "Thank you for your service," and the veterans are like, "I do not want to be here," right? And so it's like, we're grateful to you, and you should be grateful to us because we're doing this for you. And the participants are like, "Come on, you know what's happening here. You're making me do all this stuff I don't want to do," especially in 2 of my courts. And so there was this, ongoing dynamic of, this is a benefit for you, but they experience it as a burden. Also really interesting going on, as I teased out all my data was, is the military beneficial for people who use it, or is it something that's inherently harmful? I assumed that the narrative in the courtroom would be, well, obviously your participation in the military is the reason you're involved in criminalized behaving, and therefore the military by definition would be somewhat harmful. But that wasn't the narrative people were saying about the courts. The people were saying, we need to get you back to the way you were during the service, right? And there was the story about losing the structure of your military experience is the reason you're having trouble here, right? And so there was this ongoing contradiction in the hearings and in the stories people were telling about the courts is the military really beneficial or is it actually harmful? And if it is harmful, why are we celebrating the fact that you joined it? Like all of these really dynamic contradictions about the role of, the military in these individual people's lives. And the piece that was really central was they almost never talked openly about the military in the courtroom. Almost never. I was coding like, please tell me. There's like 12 examples in my 211 observations. But there was so much on the VA. There was so much on the availability of resources for these participants that just became so central to the story, that it's about the availability of these social services to these veterans that is making these courts distinct. And so as I put these pieces together, I started to think about, there's this idea that these veterans should have services because they joined the military. And then there are these services because they joined the military. And that is a feedback loop, right? If these veterans are more successful in these courts, we might say it's because there's something inherent about, what the service, gave them in terms of the capital they walked into the courtroom with and their ability to follow orders and their ability to get sober. But it's probably also related to those services that are available to them, right? If there's going to be success. And so what I ended up writing the book about was how this idea of worth matters. And it's a book about sort of the politics of worth and the politics of worth both as an ideological and a material set that reinforce each other, right? The idea that we think veterans don't just deserve this, we actually think they're better people. There's something different about who they are, not just what they did, right? And so you can understand that as animating some of the resources that the Bureau of Veterans Affairs have. And that is what is actually driving the creation of these courts, right? That yes, we think veterans might have distinct needs, and I am very, very happy to talk about those distinct needs that many people returning from the military have. But when people talked about why they created the courts, there was just this underlying, it's because we've got the VA, right? And so this was a judge who created the court in West. It was like, it's crazy not to do this when we have VA support, right? But it's not just material, right? There is an ideological foundation. We have to do something for these guys. And let's talk about gender. There were almost no women in these courts, right? Which is another side story. When I first started studying them, that was actually an issue people talked about. Now it's just, it's like everyone just like, this is for men, all right? I'm happy to address that in the Q&A. So worth has these material and these ideological foundations, right? And that's sort of where worth plays out. But when I dug into how worth is operating in these courts, I found three distinct themes. The first is this obvious notion of deservingness. And I do want to say, joining the military is a huge and very important life choice. Many people who join the military had struggles that pushed them into the military, one thing. In the military, had horrible things happen to them. Horrible, right? The numbers are all over the place, but we're talking about 15 to 20% of people coming back from the military with serious behavioral health issues, right? And then a subset of those ending up in a VTC, right? And so there is a deservingness component that people who join the military, many of them, especially those who face combat, right, have these terrible things that happen to them, and then they have to come home and they have to recover. So there is an element of deservingness. They joined the service, they're doing something for their country, that something is harmful, they come back, they struggle to reintegrate, they don't have adequate supports when they reintegrate, they engage in criminal behavior, we should help them, right? We should not treat them like people who didn't raise their hand and go do something for their country, right? That makes a lot of sense. And that's part of worth. But the other part of worth that I also found was people just saying, I like working with them. I like these guys. And I call that the affective dimension of worth. A lot of people working in these courts, I said, what distinguishes the veterans from the other criminal legal defendants that you work with? And they're like, I like them. Now, why do they like them? Because they like hierarchy. The veterans like hierarchy, right? And so the people who are working in these courts feel like they're more respectful, right? And when they talk about respect, they often use racialized language, right? So there's a whole other layer there that is also playing out in these courts. But this affective dimension of these treatment courts really does distinguish them, I think, from other treatment courts and other criminal legal processes. And I consider that part of worth. The third piece of worth that is worth mentioning is nexus. And nexus is something happened because of something. And so the idea here is that the people are in the criminal legal system. They committed some type of behavior that got them arrested because of their service. And that nexus piece is actually legislated in a lot of different states, that you actually can't access a VTC unless the criminalized behavior is related to a substance use disorder that is related to your military history, right? It's legislated. Your Houston court mandates that, right? And so when you're evaluating a potential candidate for a treatment court, a veterans treatment court, you have to decide, well, is their substance use behavior and criminal behavior related to their military service? And what I found so interesting when people talked about nexus for veterans was how expansive it was. It wasn't that they experienced, combat and it caused them to have a trauma that then they had to self-medicate, right? That's the mobilizing narrative. That's the story that you'll even see in legislatures when they're, trying to allocate funding to these. Like that. That's what I saw. I have hundreds of newspaper articles that start with that story, right? But when I talk to people about nexus, they were talking about, it's really hard to have that kind of structure and then go back into, the world where you don't have structure. And it's really hard to leave the military and not get the benefits that you thought you were going to get. And it was these really capacious understandings of what makes people engage in substance use, right? And maybe engage in criminalized behavior. And it was not excuse making, but it was an understanding that you don't see for other criminal defendants, right? And I was just so struck by that. And what was even more interesting is that some people would use these really capacious understandings of what drives people into the criminal legal system. And, of course, veterans, we should understand this for, and I'm not going to think about other people. And other people were like, I know exactly what I'm doing. So a public defender in Southeast was like, look, I don't like treatment courts. I think they demand way too much of participants without enough benefit. But man, if we're going to get trauma into the criminal legal system and get judges and other people thinking about trauma, this is the way in. And so he very strategically supported the Veterans Treatment Court because he said very clearly, I don't know the difference between that veteran and what caused them to engage in substance use, behaviors, and a person who's raised in the inner city that I see listening to gunshots all day. Like, I don't understand the difference. And so but the judges seem to think there's a difference. So I will promote my Veterans Treatment Court, and I will talk about what kinds of experiences these people have had as a way to get other people to see that the other criminal legal defendants also may have similar dynamics of trauma, right? So there's this really, really interesting way in which nexus is playing out in how people think about these courts and why they're participating and what they're doing. So, obviously, a contradiction that emerged throughout the study was, gosh, do we generalize about veterans, right? What one researcher who studies the VA is like, being a veteran is basically having the same employment experience. It's the employer. That's it. It's not the job you did, right? It's the employer. And so, one of the, a judge in West said, look, I know the veteran population isn't monolithic. Some spent a couple of months in boot camp, they got out, others had tours of duty in Iraq. This is not the same set of circumstances, and I have no problem with that. If you signed up, you should get as much help as we can give you. That is the basic essence of my argument about worth. It's not about deservingness. It's about you raised your hand, you get this treatment. All right. So that's sort of the overview of a big broad sweep of why I think these treatment courts are getting created and why they're so popular. But what does it look like in the places that these get created? Okay. I chose 3 contrasting sites. I didn't know how contrasting they would be when I chose them. So I knew that Northeast was in a more rural space. I knew that it had more racial homogeneity. I knew that it had publicly funded healthcare, right? And so I was like, well, what if I go to a place that has more racial heterogeneity, that's urban, that doesn't have as well-funded social services? And let me look at sort of also things about their entry criteria. So Northeast, for example, allows in people with VA benefits and without VA benefits. Southeast, no, only people with VA benefits, right? West allows in both. Different requirements. Northeast has a very structured program. It does require sobriety, but it also requires housing and community service and probably a job, so more demanding. Southeast, strictly sober, right? Shorter program, 14 months, right? Different requirements, but strict sobriety as well. Less worried about long-term housing and maybe employment. West does not care if you're sober. They literally said, we just don't want you to be using that really bad drug, right? And so you can be in compliance in West even if you fail your drug test for the week, as long as it wasn't that drug, right, that they think is really dangerous, right? And not really worried about housing or jobs, right? I mean, they want you to have more stable housing, right? So that was that was very interesting. The other thing that was really different about these courts is that Northeast was post disposition, which is actually not what most of these courts are not. Northeast was post disposition, and I found that really interesting. That's at the state level, that all treatment courts there are post disposition. And when I asked the probation officer about that, he said, we have more control over them when we're post disposition, because if they fail, they're in jail. Right. And so they thought that was like, so I thought that was a really interesting story, because that court also ended up to be what I call the model court. So I found that really interesting, that they thought that having that level of control over folks was making it more effective. Southeast is pre-plea and will only be pre-plea. The people in Southeast, like the public defender, will not work for a court that is not pre-plea. And that court, so that was huge, like huge. I mean, people could basically say, I don't want to do this. I'm just going to take my chances, right? And so a lot more people like not really wanting to comply in that court. Is that because it's pre-plea, or maybe other reasons? Were sort of things I wanted to understand. And West was both pre-plea and post-disposition. Okay, so those were sort of some of the differences that, I selected the cases on. But man, they felt different. They just felt different. So I open up, the middle chapter of the book talking about walking into these 3 sites. So Northeast is like this dream court that everyone talks about. It's got veteran mentors sitting together. The participants come, they hang out before court, they chat, they sit throughout the whole hearing, they stand up, they are like loving on the judge. They're like, I love this, like it's just like every dream that a veteran treatment court creator has about these courts. Southeast, I showed up at the time the courtroom was supposed to start. No one's there. Like, what's happening? We all sort of trickle in. Everyone's like, dude, let me get out of this. There's a mentor who's like trying to connect with people, but like they're like, later. And, as soon as they get up, and the judge is like speaking the whole time, like, this is good for you, this is good for you, this is good for you. And they're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And, sometimes they would say, I'm really grateful you helped me. I won't discount that did happen on occasion, but it was not. So I call that court the herding court. It was like herding cats. It was like trying to convince everyone that this was really good for them. And there was just this feeling of like, this is such a struggle. Why are we all here? But like a lot of well-meaning people working in the courts, and just a feeling of herding. It would last forever. The judge would speak, and lecture, and it's like, okay, it's 5 o'clock. Like, people want to get out of here, right? And West, I call triage. West was a court where most of the people in that courtroom, they would come in. They would have hearings in both the municipal courthouse, where people in the jail would come and sit in orange, suits there while the audience was there. And then they would have another court hearing in another space in the center of the city for the people that were not detained, going through this. And it was basically a conversation about like, is there anything we can do to help you? Will you please do something? Many of the people in that courtroom appeared intoxicated or had such long-term substance use disorders that they slurred naturally. It was it was, can we please keep you alive? I mean, that was the feeling. And it was a lot of effort by the clinicians to just really like barely get through to the people, will you please go to an appointment, right? So I call it triage, right? So these are just like totally different courts, right? But they're all veterans treatment courts. And, everyone's like, let's standardize and talk about recidivism rates. And I was like, wow, I don't know if we're there yet, right? These are completely different courts, right? And how do they matter for the participants? So what I say is this really helps us understand the limits of worth in context. And what I try to go through in the book is to talk about, well, how do we understand these differences, right? Because there's some things that obvious, right? Access to resources. It's, we'll just throw money at the problem, right? And I don't want to be that kind of researcher. That's not actually the only thing going on here. So what matters in these courts and why I think this sort of move to standardize is a bit of a problem. So the locale really mattered, right? The place these courts were created. So in Northeast, most of the people are there because they have family there. And so they've got a stronger social base, right? Southeast and West, more transient. People were choosing to be there. They didn't have those same types of support systems. And so you've got a different population. You in these regions have massive social capital differences, right? That map onto race too, right? And you've got also, really importantly, right? All that matters for the demographics of the participants. That's fine. But what really matters is the criminal legal actors and the social services and how they organize with one another, right? If you've got a place that has really good relationships between the public defender and the prosecutor and probation, you're going to have a different type of collaboration than if you're in a space where those parties do not like working together. If you have really functional social services, you're going to have a different region. If you have a very good VA health center, right? Which is sort of providing the healthcare to the participants that are VA eligible. If there's a good relationship between the VA and the local veterans, right? All that's going to matter. So those features really matter for how these courts operate. But this is the story that really emerged over years of observation, which is how these courts were founded really shaped these differences. And that's the story, right? Is that in these three places, the amount of organization that went into creating those types of collaborations that were needed were very different. So in Northeast, it was a district attorney who got together with various partners, made sure that they were in good connection with a residential facility, made sure that they contacted the veterans community and got a veteran champion to spearhead a very robust peer mentor program from the beginning. Worked with the state level, observed different courtrooms, right? Really organized, planned launch of this treatment court, ready to go. And you could see that. Really well done court, right? Southeast, I asked various people about the origins, and they said, we really wanted to do this. And the first thing we did, as happened in actually all states, was we just have to document that there's a problem. We have to figure out how to document like how many veterans there are, this, that, and the other. But in Southeast, it was a judge who, was looking for an opportunity, saw a call for a grant come in from the Bureau of Justice Administration and said, I want that grant. Wrote the grant. And, and I said, why should I just, I really want to do something. I wanted to do something. And did not coordinate with the VA. I got on the phone with the local VA and they were like, that court got created without anyone telling us. And that judge started mandating treatments that we don't provide, right? Didn't have a court coordinator, right? But when I first went to that court, I saw one court hearing and then the funder came and shut it down for 3 months. Said, this is so dysfunctional, I cannot allow anyone else to enroll. And so everyone who was enrolled then had to have their cases on hold for 3 months until they got their act together, hired a court coordinator who was an extremely experienced drug court coordinator who then was like, we are following that drug court model like to the T, right? Which actually created conflicts with some of the clinicians that are like, we're not, a lot of these participants are here because they're veterans. They don't actually have substance use disorders that require this level of surveillance. But that court coordinator's like, this is how it works, right? And so that creates its own, dynamic. And then West, interestingly, emerged out of a community court. So it started off as a court that was serving low-level misdemeanor public, life offenses in a neighborhood that was dealing with really serious homelessness and substance use disorder. And they said, we've got a lot of veterans here and we can get them to the VA. So let's create a separate veterans docket in our community justice center. And then that grew into the city's Veterans Treatment Court. So they had a completely different orientation to what they were doing. They were like, we're here to basically be a social service provider. And now we're going to expand, in all these ways, and we're going to get more resources because we're serving veterans. But that was their orientation from the beginning because of how it originated, right? So these founding stories are very central to why these three courts are operating really differently. Obviously, access to resources also explain why they're operating differently. And the one piece I'll say on this is, I've been asked, well, what could we do? Because we can't, a residential facility. The Northeast had access to a residential facility that many of the participants were in, and it was a wraparound service provider that allowed stability as these participants went through that hearing. Most of the arguments and conflicts that I saw in these courts in West and Southeast were about access to residential facilities and residential facilities that these veterans did not want to be in. A veteran-specific residential facility in Northeast was the answer. It wasn't just the peer mentors. It was that. It was a residential facility. And so that was a huge piece of the story about the success, if you want to say, of these different courts. The other difference that, beyond these sort of structural factors was there was a lot of benchcraft to study in these three courts. The Northeast judge, I documented, I case coded how much time people spent speaking in each hearing. And in Northeast, the judge spoke 23% of the time. And in Southeast, it was 75%, right? They just were doing this really differently. And so I think that the way that the judges were trying to get buy-in from the participants also created all sorts of dynamics of it, different dynamics in that courtroom. I have a whole chapter about that I call conflicted gratitude and sort of how these sort of relationships emerged in these courtrooms, right? So again, you've got this national story, you've got these national courts, but they look really different. And these are some of the reasons I document about why they look really different. So why does this matter? What does this tell us about, these bigger questions about inequality? So one of the veterans justice officers who, works for the VA and sort of oversees these courts, he was like, yeah, I totally hear you about the differences you're seeing. I think of VTCs as a concept, not as a model. And I thought that was a really nice distinction, that a lot of people come to him and they want to create these courts and they want to say, well, what's the model for how we do this? This is exactly what I saw with Truth Commission. So I was like, this is what I saw on the international stage, and I'm seeing it like in this interesting space. But he was like, it's not, it's a concept. And yeah, like what you're seeing in terms of these local dynamics really matter. Now, so, what I saw though is that fact means that these types of inequalities get reproduced. And so how and why, and why does this matter? So in a local community, there's certain access to resources that are just available to everybody, right? And there's different people who are differently situated in need. And so these courts are oftentimes just sort of replicating those differences. But they're also really replicating the differences between people who have access to VA benefits and people who don't. And so one of the things that just came out so clearly in this study was that these courts that don't allow in people without VA benefits are excluding some of the most needy and the most vulnerable veterans, like full stop, like that is a problem. But once you get into the courtroom and you have access to VA benefits, you're in just a different class. So in West, there are 3 clinicians for the population that has VA benefits, but that's only half the population. Half of the population in West doesn't have access to VA benefits. And the Department of Public Health is the one funding that clinician, and they will only fund one position. And so at one point during my observations, West had to not accept eligible veterans because that clinician said, I can't add any more people to my caseload. And they actually decided to do an internal study because they said the quality of care that the veterans with VA benefits are getting versus the ones that aren't, just in the residential facilities. The one with benefits, the VA benefits, are staying in residential facilities that are beautiful and have all sorts of services. And the ones without are in these terrible places that no one really wants to be, right? But they're going through the same program with such a different access to services. And who has access to VA benefits is highly racialized, right? All of these things sort of compound over time, right, in terms of reproducing these kinds of inequalities, right, both in local settings and in the VA. And so I sort of, that's a big takeaway from these courts. But the bigger question for me about inequality is thinking about, okay, this is a sort of standard critique. It's like, what drove people into the military? What kinds of harms did they experience in the military? What kind of harms did they experience right after? And then now we're going to try to help them, right? And so there's all of these other pieces. And one of the things that's so interesting about these courts is that they absolve the responsibility for people's struggles that might be rooted in other institutions like education, right? Or other types of social services and say, it's the military, right? And that becomes a really convenient way to explain why veterans are in the criminal legal system and somehow different, that takes away why do people join the military in the first place? Very often, the studies show it's for professional and educational opportunities, right? Again, not to discount that extremely important choice and like the extraordinary sacrifice that people make, right? That's not the point of the book. The point of the book is to say that if the story we tell about these participants is that they're somehow different than the regular population in the criminal legal system, it's not true, right? It's actually not true when you look across. And we can think about, well, what does that do? I worry that if we destigmatize, and we should, if we destigmatize people who went into the military and then have criminal legal behavior, it can re-stigmatize people who made other life choices, right? And so that, that's an interesting, thing to consider. But really, what really, from the beginning to the end of my study was, what if we treated everyone with this much care? I mean, just the respect that the people in that courtroom were given for that life choice. Again, I've got respect for that life choice. I'm a nonviolence person, and I emerged from this study with like such a different level of respect for the military, people who join it and people who support veterans. Like really, really, really grew in that way. And I still wondered, what would it look like for participants in a regular courthouse to be treated with a "what can we do for you" attitude, right? Again, not to discount, what victims need and like really, the harms that people who commit crimes can do. But those dynamics in this court really give a model for thinking about a reformed criminal legal system and give a model that interestingly appeals across the political spectrum. These courts are supported across the political spectrum because of the narrative we have about veterans. And so that's what I hope to show in the book and present to you all, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. For 5 minutes. Let's take a couple questions because we only have a few minutes, and then. In veteran treatment courts. Is there a certain reason, or is it just? I want to understand that because there's, there were women. The story about these courts is that they provide camaraderie and structure for the participants. But what you saw when a woman was in the courtroom is she felt, a lot of isolation. I think I don't know the data on women who are arrested, but I suspect that the women who are arrested are not being funneled into these courts, and there might be a gendered component to the high risk, high need assessment that's going on. So that might be just a big part of, they're just not getting funneled into the courthouses. They might be choosing not to do it because it feels like a masculine space. The residential facility that I observed took me to the women's facility and told me that the women in that facility were much higher need than the men, and most of them had sexual trauma. And so that is a huge part of what's going on in the female community that's struggling in this way, that this courtroom might not be the right space. So I think there's, people opt into these courts and then they opt out. And so those are sort of ways that I could explain what might be going on also. Yeah.
Did you happen to get recidivism rates across all of them?
I have a sort of, they're not at the same time. So I've got a sort of overview of, so I have all the data for the years that I was observing Southeast. I have, West gave me, I think, 6 years of data from like prior, and Northeast just gave me quotes, right? So I don't like to compare them because for a couple reasons. One is they're different snapshots of different things. Two, I think the entry criteria is doing most of the work here. And so West is allowing in people who have much longer criminal histories than the other courts. And so they're, no. You just asked about recidivism data. No, I have graduation data. So I do not have recidivism data. So what I just talked about was graduation data. So I don't know about the recidivism. But if there is a difference, I'm going to say it's entry criteria. Yeah.
How has this work really influenced your thoughts on transitional justice in the other countries?
Wow. I think war sucks. And, you know, the long-term consequences of war affect everybody. So I guess that's what I would say to that. And, you know, I think that, you know, I went to law school already having worked at that time in post-conflict settings, questioning why we were using international criminal law to address these types of atrocities rather than other types of avenues of resource expenditures. And I think that I'm probably more skeptical of that than I am of this. I'm very pragmatic. It's sort of like, look, I would love a world where we don't need the criminal legal system to help people stay sober, right? I'm not sure that that is, I'm very sympathetic to what these court actors are doing. I'm happy to work on ways in making it better and not say don't do it at all. And so, you know, and I think that, yeah. You know, again, I think these are very different spaces because what's going on in these veterans treatment courts is not about war. To the extent that it's about people's experiences during war, it's really not. But militarism, our investment in like that as that is like the fact that we have a military often means we're going to use it. So, and then what are going to be the long-term consequences for veterans, right? So it just helps me have a bigger, deeper understanding of the long-term damage of war and to not think about it as this, but to really see the long tail of what this type of conflict resolution strategy leads to. Yeah.
You mentioned risk assessments. Did you find that there were high-risk IDs? Was that part of the eligibility criteria across all three?
Yeah, it's a great question. So high risk, high need, for those who aren't familiar with treatment courts, the data shows that you should not put someone in this level of surveillance unless they are high risk for recidivism and high need for social services. The studies on veterans treatment courts illustrate, and actually this was like, I was in cognitive dissonance land all through the end of, you know, the All Rise meetings, because half the, you know, I would go to sort of regular sessions that interested me also, and they would talk about high risk, high need, and then I would go to these veteran sessions and they'd be like, let all veterans in. I'm like, I'm sorry, this is not making any sense to me. And so I think the veterans treatment courts, in order to keep their numbers up, are absolutely not following a high risk, high need. They're like, we can help veterans because we understand veterans and we have access to veterans. And so I think they're much more comfortable avoiding the tricky messaging that is like the data shows that you shouldn't be in these courts unless you're high risk and high need. I mean, there was deep complaints about that in Southeast. The clinicians were like, why are you drug testing this person and disrupting their life every week? They don't have substance use disorder, right? They didn't get in because of substance use. They got in because they're a veteran who committed a crime, right? So that's what I'm saying. It's sort of mapping these things that, you know, it's the add veteran and stir, but like, what are you stirring on top of, right? On a model that, you know, may not, it's, you know, they're mixing all sorts of different things and creating all these other problems.
We are out of time for the faculty, but if you are a student, please stay. And let's give one more round of applause to Dr. Rowen.